The wind descending from the mountains of Aldenmoor smelled of burning pine and damp earth, the kind of scent Lucy had learned to associate with the day of the great market, when the packs from neighboring territories came down to the village to trade, celebrate, and remind the world exactly who held power and who did not. She carried a wicker basket on her left arm, heavier than her frame suggested she could manage, filled with medicinal herbs gathered before dawn, burdock root, dried yarrow leaves, and 3 bundles of lavender that her mother had cultivated until her final day. The scent of the herbs mingled with the cold morning air, and Lucy breathed deeply whenever she could, letting that familiar fragrance settle something inside her chest that always seemed reluctant to be still. She was 23 years old, with eyes the color of a winter sky and hair so pale and long she had to braid it twice to keep it from dragging along the ground. She wore a linen tunic, faded to the color of old bone, and over her shoulders she carried the gray wool cloak she had inherited from her mother, mended in 2 places, but clean and well kept, because Lucy understood that dignity had nothing to do with wealth. Omega. That was what they called her, and she never argued the point. In the hierarchy of Aldenmoor's packs, Omegas occupied the lowest rung. They served, healed, harvested, wove, and learned early to take up as little space as possible. Lucy had no pack. Her father had died when she was 8, leaving behind nothing but debts and a name no one respected. Her mother, a healer without known lineage, had died 3 winters past. Since then, Lucy had survived alone, selling herbs and medicinal preparations at the market, sleeping in the back room of the inn in exchange for work in the kitchen. It was not a large life, but it was hers. The great market of Aldenmoor took place in the central square of the village, ringed by dark stone buildings veined with moss, colored banners strung between the windows above the stalls. There were bolts of cloth, spice merchants, forged tools, live birds in reed cages, barrels of mead and spiced wine. The smell was dense and alive: leather, smoke, honey, sweat, timber, and the unmistakable scent of wolves from different territories, something that ordinary humans might not have noticed, but which Lucy, despite not being a wolf herself, had learned to read after a lifetime spent among them. She found her usual place between Marta the weaver's stall and the old blacksmith who sold nails and tools. She arranged the herbs with care, pinned a small parchment with her prices written in ink, and stood waiting. The morning passed slowly. She sold 2 bundles of lavender to a farmer's wife, a clay vial of burdock extract to the healer from the neighboring village, and politely declined an offer from the merchant Oswin, who wanted to pay half her asking price for her finest herbs on the grounds that Omegas without a pack could not afford to be selective about buyers. Lucy smiled and said she preferred to wait. Oswin huffed and walked away. That was when she saw her. The old woman appeared through the northern entrance of the square, walking with slow but deliberate steps, leaning on a staff of dark wood, polished smooth by time. She was small, her back curved gently with age, her white hair pinned in a simple knot, and she wore a dark wool mantle, austere, without embroidery, but of unmistakable quality to anyone who knew how to look. Her eyes were gray and watchful, taking in everything around her with a stillness that seemed almost strange for someone walking alone through a busy market. Lucy did not know who she was. She had never seen her before. The old woman stopped in front of the stall of a hide merchant named Roderick, a broad man with a thick neck and a voice that habitually rose above every other conversation nearby. She asked a simple question, pointing toward a cured leather piece hanging from the stall's frame. What Roderick said next made Lucy straighten her spine. "Old woman, are you lost?" His voice carried the kind of contempt that did not need volume to wound. "The alms are on the other side of the square. This is for people with real silver, not for packless beggars." Some people nearby laughed, others looked away, the kind of discomfort that does not become action. The old woman did not retreat. She did not flinch. She remained exactly where she stood, her staff firm against the stone floor, and looked at Roderick with an expression Lucy could not quite name. It was not anger, not humiliation. It was closer to patience. As though she had known men like him her entire life and already understood precisely what they were worth. "I asked for the price," the old woman said, her voice calm and clear. A simple answer would have been sufficient. "And I told you to leave," Roderick said, stepping forward, using his size the way men like him always did. "Before I call the guards to have you removed from the square for vagrancy." Lucy was already moving before she had consciously decided to. She stepped around Marta's stall, crossed the narrow space between the merchants, and came to stand beside the old woman. Not in front of her, because this woman clearly required no physical shielding, but beside her, basket on her arm, eyes fixed on Roderick. "She asked a merchant's question," Lucy said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You are obliged to answer it, or to say you do not wish to sell." Threatening an elderly woman with the guards for asking a question is not the conduct of an honest man. The silence that formed around them was the kind that has weight. Roderick turned his gaze to her, and Lucy recognized the look. He was calculating. Seeing what she was, the mended cloak, the herb basket, the absence of any pack markings at her wrists or collar. A packless Omega. Someone he considered as disposable as the old woman herself. "You're the little herb girl," he said, with a smile that was not a smile. "The dead healer's daughter. Mind your place before I remember how many debts your family's name still carries in this square." Lucy felt heat rise in her face, but she did not look away. "My father's debts were settled with the last of my mother's possessions before she died," she replied evenly. "You know this, Roderick, because you were the one who received the payment. If you would like, I can repeat the exact sum aloud so that everyone here may hear it." His smile disappeared. Around them, the silence had become a tension. Merchants, buyers, servants, all watching, some with curiosity, some with discomfort, and at least 2 or 3 with something that looked very much like restrained approval. Roderick went red. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then did what men like him always do when they realize they have lost the argument in public. He looked away and pretended something else required his attention. Lucy exhaled slowly and turned to the old woman. Up close, the woman was even more striking than she appeared at a distance. There was something in those gray eyes, a still depth, like quiet water over ancient stone. She was looking at Lucy without surprise, without excessive warmth, but with a completeness of attention that was almost unsettling. "Thank you," the old woman said. Her voice was low, but it carried natural weight, the kind of weight that comes from decades of being listened to. "You did that knowing he might turn on you." "He had already turned on you without reason," Lucy answered simply. "It seemed wrong to let it pass." The old woman tilted her head slightly, as someone does when they are noting something worth remembering. "Are you a healer?" she asked, glancing at the basket. "An herb keeper," Lucy corrected. "I know simple remedies. I have no formal healer's training, but I learned from my mother." "What is your name?" "Lucy." She hesitated for just a moment. "No pack name." "I know," said the old woman. "But I asked for your name, not your pack's." Something in that answer undid Lucy in a way she could not explain. She almost smiled. "Lucy," she said again, this time without the addition. The old woman nodded. "I am Alara." At that moment, a murmur moved through the edge of the square, coming from the eastern entrance. Lucy raised her eyes and saw the guards first. Black armor bearing the mark of a pack she did not immediately recognize, but which made the merchants around them straighten instinctively, the way people do when they sense authority before they understand its source. Behind the guards, on horseback, came 3 men. The first was broad and fair-haired, with an open expression and eyes that swept the square as though searching for something entertaining. The second was leaner, with an easy smile and relaxed posture, the kind of man who always seemed on the verge of saying something dry. But it was the third who made Lucy forget, for a moment, to breathe. He was tall, very tall, with dark hair braided and falling over his shoulders, and eyes of a blue so intense they looked carved from cold stone. He wore black leather armor with crossed straps across his chest and a dark fur mantle that moved with the morning wind. He was not looking at anything in particular, and yet Lucy had the strange certainty that he had already seen everything worth seeing. The guards opened a path. The square, without anyone needing to say a word, drew back slightly. That instinctive shift people make when they recognize that something far larger than themselves has just entered the space. Beside Lucy, Ilara watched the arrival of the three men with that same expression of serene patience. And then the man with blue eyes, the third, the quietest, turned his gaze directly toward where they stood. Not toward the square, not toward the merchants, toward Ilara. And then, for 1 second that Lucy felt last far longer than it should have, toward her. The man with blue eyes dismounted before his guards had fully stopped moving. It was the kind of movement that required no announcement. Fluid, certain, the motion of someone who had never needed to signal his intentions to anyone. His boots met the stone of the square with a sound that Lucy felt more than heard, and the crowd parted around him the way water parts around something immovable dropped into a river. The fair-haired man dismounted after him, already grinning. The leaner one followed, adjusting the strap of a short sword at his hip with the casual air of someone who wore weapons the way others wore rings, habitually, and without thinking about it. Lucy stood very still. She was not afraid. She was something else, aware, in the way she became aware of a change in weather before the clouds arrived, that the air around her had shifted in quality. The scent she had learned to associate with powerful wolves, something like rain-soaked iron and dark resin, was suddenly much stronger, and it was coming from the direction of the man with the braided dark hair who was now walking directly toward them, toward Ilara. He stopped 3 paces away. His blue eyes moved to the old woman first, and something in his expression changed. Not dramatically, not with the softness of ordinary men, but with a quieting, the way a river goes still just before it deepens. "Mother," he said. The word landed in Lucy's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She turned to look at Ilara. The old woman was watching the tall man with an expression that was almost amused, patient, measured, and entirely unsurprised by his arrival. "You are late," Ilara said simply. "You left before dawn without telling anyone where you were going," he replied. His voice was low and even, with the controlled quality of someone who chose each word deliberately, never spending more than was necessary. "The entire guard has been looking for you since the second bell." "I went to the market," Ilara said, as though this explained everything, which apparently to her, it did. "I am not an invalid, Aiden." The name moved through the square like a current beneath water, invisible on the surface, but felt by everyone standing in it. Lucy watched the merchants around her absorb it, watched shoulders drop an inch, watched eyes lower. Aiden. She knew the name. Everyone in every territory within 3 days' ride knew the name. Alpha King Aiden of the Iron Crest, ruler of the largest pack confederation in the northern lands, whose bloodline traced back to the first wolves, whose word ended wars and began alliances, whose silence in a room was considered more dangerous than another man's threat. Lucy looked at Ilara again. The small woman with the dark wool mantle and the walking staff. The woman who had stood her ground in front of Roderick without blinking. The woman whose gray eyes held the particular stillness of someone who had never in her life needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. The Alpha King's mother. Lucy became acutely aware of every mend in her cloak. Aiden's gaze shifted. It moved from Alara, swept briefly and efficiently across the square. Cataloging, she realized. The way a commander assesses terrain. And then settled on Lucy with the same quality of attention he had given the crowd, except that it did not move on. It stayed. "Who is this?" he asked. He was speaking to Alara, but he had not looked away from Lucy. "Someone with more courage than most of your guards," Alara said, with the dry precision of a woman who said exactly what she meant. "And better manners than most of your court." The fair-haired man behind Aiden made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. The leaner one tilted his head with an expression of open curiosity. Lucy straightened. She had spent her entire life being assessed by people who saw only the mended cloak and the empty wrist, and she had learned that the only dignified response to being looked at as though you were less was to stand as though you were not. "My name is Lucy," she said, addressing Aiden directly, because looking at the floor had never solved anything. "I keep an herb stall at this market." Something shifted in his expression. Not softness. She doubted that word applied to him in any simple way. But a fractional adjustment. The way a man looks when he has expected one thing and encountered something slightly different. "She defended me," Alara said, nodding toward Roderick's stall without looking at it. A merchant chose to be unpleasant. She chose not to allow it. Aiden turned his head toward Roderick's stall. The hide merchant had gone very still behind his table, the color of old candle wax, staring at a point somewhere past the Alpha King's shoulder, with the focused desperation of a man hoping very hard not to be noticed. He was noticed. Aiden looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. He said nothing. He simply looked, and whatever Roderick found in those blue eyes was apparently sufficient, because the merchant sat down heavily on his stool and did not move again for the remainder of the morning. The fair-haired man stepped forward, extending a hand toward Lucy with easy confidence. "Cale," he said. "I am the one who keeps him from being entirely unreasonable." He tilted his head toward Aiden. "It is a demanding occupation." "He is the one who keeps himself from being entertaining," the leaner man added, appearing at Cale's shoulder. "I am Dorian. I handle everything Cale forgets, which is considerable." Lucy accepted Cale's handshake carefully. "Lucy," she said again, because she had nothing else to offer in introduction. No title, no pack, no lineage worth announcing. "We know," Dorian said, with a small smile that was not unkind. "Alara has already told us." Lucy turned to find that Alara had moved. She was now standing slightly closer, and she was watching Lucy with an expression that was difficult to read, layered in a way that reminded Lucy of the oldest manuscripts in the village scribe's collection, full of meaning that required time to properly understand. "I would like to purchase some of your herbs," Alara said, "if you are still selling." "Of course," Lucy said, because that was the straightforward answer, and straightforward answers were the ones she trusted most. She led Alara back toward her stall, aware with every step of the precise and careful distance that Aiden maintained behind them. Close enough that she could feel the presence of him, that dark iron and resin scent that her instincts kept trying to process into something it had no proper category for. Far enough that he was not crowding the conversation. He was, she realized, giving his mother space while watching every person in the square with the systematic attention of a man who never truly stopped working. At the stall, Alara studied the herbs with genuine knowledge, lifting the lavender, pressing the dried yarrow between 2 fingers, bending to smell the burdock root with the precise interest of someone who understood what they were looking at. "Your mother taught you well," Alara said quietly. "She knew every plant that grows in these hills," Lucy said. There was a small ache in the words that she did not try to conceal, because concealing it required energy she preferred to spend on other things. "She said the land remembers things that people forget." Alara was quiet for a moment. "She was right," the old woman said. Then, "How long have you been alone?" The question was direct in a way that might have felt intrusive from someone else. From Alara, it felt more like the question a healer asks when she is trying to understand the full nature of a wound. 3 winters, Lucy said. Alara nodded, still looking at the herbs. Behind them, Lucy heard Kale say something low to Dorian that she could not make out, and Dorian's quiet response. She did not turn around. What she did notice, and noticed with the clarity of someone who had spent years learning to read the spaces between things, was that Aiden had not spoken again since their introduction, had not moved to inspect the square's other merchants, or speak with the village's pack leaders, who she could see hovering at the edges of the crowd, clearly waiting for an audience with him. He was standing 7 paces behind her, and he had not looked away. She knew this without looking. She could feel it the way she could feel weather, not as something she saw, but as a pressure in the air, a change in the quality of the light. It was a deeply inconvenient thing to notice, and she decided firmly that noticing it meant nothing. Alara selected a bundle of lavender, the dried yarrow, and 2 vials of an herbal oil that Lucy had prepared herself, rosemary and cold-pressed seed oil, good for joints that stiffened in winter. She paid for them without negotiating, which was unusual enough that Lucy checked twice to make sure the coin was correct. It was more than correct. "This is too much," Lucy said. "It is the appropriate price," Alara replied, in a tone that gently and completely closed the subject. She tucked the herbs into the fold of her mantle, then looked up at Lucy with those gray eyes that held depths Lucy was still trying to estimate. "I would like you to come to the keep," she said. Lucy stared at her. "The Iron Crest Keep," Alara continued, as though this were the most ordinary invitation in the world. "I have been looking for a competent herb keeper for some time. The one we had retired last winter, and the 2 since have known considerably less than they claimed. Lucy stopped, started again. "I live here. My work is here." "Your stall is here," Alara said, with the gentle precision of someone making a distinction that mattered. "That is not quite the same thing." She tilted her head. "You would have your own quarters, a proper herb garden, access to the keep's collection of manuscripts on plant lore. You would be compensated fairly. And you would not be subject to merchants who confuse your patience for weakness." Lucy was quiet. She was aware, distantly, that every pack leader on the edges of the square was still waiting, that the Alpha King of the Iron Crest was standing 7 paces behind her, that the entire market had taken on the particular quality of a held breath. She was also aware that this was the kind of moment that looked simple from the outside, and was not simple at all on the inside. "I would need to think about it," she said carefully. Alara smiled. It was the first full smile Lucy had seen from her, and it transformed her face entirely. Not into something younger, exactly, but into something warmer, like a fire that had been burning steadily for a long time. "Of course," the old woman said. She pressed the coins into Lucy's hand and closed her fingers around them. "We will be here until tomorrow's first bell. You know where to find us." She turned and walked back toward her son, with the same slow, deliberate steps she had arrived with, and Aiden fell into place beside her, one hand briefly at her elbow on the uneven stone, with a carefulness so practiced it looked effortless. Just before the crowd closed between them, he glanced back. It was brief, specific, the kind of look that did not pretend to be something else. Lucy stood at her stall with a handful of coins and a decision she had not asked for, watching the Alpha King of the Iron Crest disappear into the crowd with his mother on his arm. Around her, the market slowly remembered how to breathe. Lucy did not sleep that night. She lay on her narrow cot in the back room of the inn, staring at the ceiling beams, while the sounds of the common room filtered through the wall. Laughter, the scrape of benches, the occasional crash of a dropped tankard. The fire in the kitchen had burned down to coals, and the room held just enough warmth to keep the cold from being cruel. She turned the coins over in her hand. Alara had paid 3 times the fair price for herbs that any village market stall would have sold for considerably less. It was not charity. Lucy had seen enough charity to recognize the particular texture of it, the way it always carried a faint weight of condescension beneath the gesture. This had been something different. A transaction treated as though the thing being purchased was worth exactly what was paid, and perhaps more. She thought about the keep. The Iron Crest was 3 hours' ride north, set into the mountain pass where the 2 great forests met. She had seen it once from a distance, when she was perhaps 12 years old, and had climbed the eastern hill on a clear day. It had looked less like a building, and more like something the mountain had decided to become. Dark stone towers rising from the rock itself, walls thick enough to swallow sound, banners the color of deep iron hanging from the parapets. The kind of place that made you understand, without anyone needing to explain it, that the people inside it had been powerful for a very long time. She thought about Alara's gray eyes, about the steadiness in them, the quality of someone who had survived things that would have unmade others, and had come out the other side not hardened, exactly, but distilled, clarified. She thought, briefly and against her better judgment, about Aiden, about the way he had looked at Roderick for 3 seconds and reduced the man to silence without a single word, about the carefulness with which he had placed his hand at his mother's elbow on the uneven stone, so practiced it looked effortless, the gesture of a man who was, in whatever private way he kept private things, genuinely devoted to her safety. About the glance he had cast back before the crowd had closed between them. She stopped thinking about Aiden. She sat up, braided her hair for something to do with her hands, and made herself consider the practical reality of the decision in front of her. Here, in Aldenmore, she had a stall, a cot, and a kitchen that was not hers. She had no pack, no protection, no name that opened doors. She had Marta the weaver, who was kind in a busy, distracted way, and old Perrin the blacksmith, who sometimes saved her a heel of bread when the mornings were cold. She had the memory of her mother's garden and a chest of manuscripts on plant lore that she had read so many times the pages had softened at the corners. She had stability. She had smallness. She had survived 3 winters alone by becoming very good at taking up exactly as much space as the world was willing to give her. At the Iron Crest, she would have a garden, manuscripts, proper tools, and the protection, however indirect, of the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories, which meant that no merchant would ever again suggest she mind her place before he remembered her debts. She rose before the dawn bell, folded her cloak, packed the small chest that held everything she owned, and went to find Alara. The Iron Crest's traveling party had camped at the edge of the village, where the road widened before the northern pass. It was a proper camp, orderly, with guards posted at measured intervals, and fires laid in a pattern that suggested long practice. The horses were tended, the equipment was maintained, and the whole arrangement had the quality of controlled efficiency that Lucy was beginning to associate with anything connected to Aiden. She was stopped at the perimeter by 2 guards in black armor, which she had expected. She had not expected Cale to appear behind them 30 seconds later, apparently already awake and unreasonably cheerful for the hour. "Lucy the herb keeper," he said, waving the guards aside with the ease of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Alara said you would come before dawn," he smiled. "She is not often wrong about these things." "She is never wrong about these things," Dorian said, materializing from somewhere to Cale's left with a steaming cup of something that smelled of bark tea and spiced honey. He offered it to Lucy with a slight nod. "You look like someone who has not slept." "I slept," Lucy said. "Poorly," Dorian replied without judgment. She accepted the cup and followed them through the camp. Alara was seated near the central fire, wrapped in a heavier mantle than she had worn the day before, a small book open across her knees. She looked up when Lucy approached and closed the book with the unhurried motion of someone who had been expecting this exact moment. "You decided?" the old woman said. It was not a question. "I decided," Lucy confirmed, She wrapped both hands around the warm cup. "I have conditions." Alara's expression did not change, but something in her eyes sharpened slightly with what might have been approval. "State them," she said. "I manage the herb garden according to my own methods. I answer to you on matters of the household, but no one else directs my work without your sanction. I keep my mother's chest of manuscripts, and if it does not suit after 3 months, I am free to leave without obligation." Alara was quiet for a moment. "Agreed," she said simply. "All of it." Lucy nodded. She had not realized until that moment how much tension she had been carrying in her shoulders. She sat down across from the old woman, and they spoke for a while about the herb garden, what it currently held, what it lacked, what the previous keeper had mismanaged and why. Alara knew plants the way someone knows them when they have paid attention over a long life, not with formal training, but with accumulated observation. Lucy found herself engaged before she had entirely meant to be, leaning forward, asking questions, offering the names of varieties she grew that Alara had not mentioned. She did not notice Aiden until his shadow crossed the fire. He had approached from the far side of the camp, wearing a simpler version of yesterday's armor. The fur mantle was gone, replaced by a dark wool cloak, and his braided hair was pulled back from his face. He moved with the same quality she had noticed in the square. Not loud, not announcing itself, simply present in a way that made itself known. He stopped at the edge of the firelight. "She accepted," Alara said, without looking up from the conversation she was having with Lucy about the relative merits of dried versus fresh calendula. "I heard," Aiden said. His voice, Lucy noted with the detached interest of someone cataloging useful information, sounded different in the open air of early morning than it had in the crowded square. Quieter, less a command and more a weight. He looked at Lucy across the fire. She looked back at him, because looking away from things that made her uncertain had never struck her as a useful habit. "The keep has rules," he said. "Most places do," she replied. Something shifted in his expression. That same fractional adjustment she had seen the day before, the one she could not quite name. "The herb garden is on the east side of the inner wall," he continued. "It receives morning light. The previous keeper let the rosemary go to wood and didn't manage the drainage properly. The north bed floods in hard rain." Lucy blinked. It was not what she had expected him to say. "I can fix the drainage," she said. "Raised beds and crushed stone. It's not complicated." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with those blue eyes that gave nothing away, and somehow still communicated something she could not translate. "Kale will show you to the supply wagon," he said finally. "Your chest can travel with the household goods." He turned and walked back toward the far side of the camp. Lucy watched him go. "He researched the garden's problems this morning," Dorian said quietly from somewhere behind her left shoulder. She had not heard him approach. "Before you arrived, he wanted to be useful." Lucy turned to look at Dorian. The leaner man had an expression of careful neutrality that was doing a moderate job of concealing something amused underneath it. "He does that," Dorian continued. "Finds the practical thing. It is how he shows." He stopped, reconsidered. "It is how he prepares." Lucy decided not to examine that sentence too closely. The camp broke before the second bell, moving with the practiced efficiency of a group that had traveled together many times. Lucy's chest was loaded onto the supply wagon. She was given a horse, a calm gray mare that smelled of hay and winter grass, and a riding position near the center of the column, beside Alara's covered cart. As the party moved north toward the pass, the village of Aldenmore fell away behind her. She did not look back. Looking back had never struck her as useful either. What she did notice, as the road narrowed into the forest and the pine trees closed overhead like the pillars of a very old hall, was that Aiden rode at the head of the column, facing forward, and that twice in the first hour, he turned his head at an angle that was not quite toward her, but was not quite away either. Alara, riding beside her in the open cart with her small book and her walking staff, said nothing about this. But she was smiling. The iron crest materialized from the mountain in the late afternoon, when the light had gone gold and long. Up close, it was even more immovable than Lucy had imagined from the distant hill of her childhood. The walls rose in tiers of dark stone, smoothed by centuries of wind. The towers connected by covered walkways and internal staircases that disappeared into the rock itself. The gate was iron-banded timber, 2 handspans thick, and the courtyard beyond it was wide enough to hold a full pack assembly with room to spare. Wolves stopped to watch as they entered. Not with hostility, with the particular attention of a pack that was assessing something new in its territory. Lucy kept her eyes forward, her spine straight, and let them look. A young woman broke from the line of servants near the great hall door, hurrying toward Lucy with an expression of barely contained excitement. She had dark red hair escaping from a loose braid, quick brown eyes, and the energy of someone who moved through the world at a speed slightly faster than everyone else. "You must be Lucy," she said, slightly out of breath. "I'm Wren. I manage the household linens, and I've been hoping for months that Alara would find someone proper for the garden, because the last keeper let the mint take over the south bed entirely, and it's been a catastrophe." She paused, took a breath. "Sorry, I do that." "It's fine," Lucy said, and found that she meant it. Something about Wren's uncomplicated warmth was easier than most things had been in recent memory. "I'll show you your quarters," Wren said. "They're in the east wing, which means you'll hear the garden birds in the morning, which I personally think is the best thing about the whole keep." She leaned slightly closer and lowered her voice to a tone that was not quite a whisper. "Also, you're the talk of the entire household already. Word travels fast in a pack keep." "What are they saying?" Lucy asked carefully. Wren grinned. "That you told off Roderick the hide merchant in front of half the great market." She paused. "And that the Alpha King hasn't looked at his correspondence all afternoon." Lucy said nothing to that. She followed Wren through the great hall, up a curved stone staircase, and into a room that was small but real. A proper bed, a writing desk, a window that looked out over the east garden where the rosemary had, as described, gone thoroughly to wood. She set her mother's chest at the foot of the bed and pressed her palm flat against the lid. 3 winters alone, a cot in a borrowed kitchen, a stall that barely paid for bread. She looked out the window at the garden in the last of the afternoon gold, already mentally measuring the north bed's drainage problem, already thinking about what could be salvaged and what needed to start again from seed. Outside, somewhere in the courtyard below, she heard Aiden's voice. A word of instruction to someone, low and brief. The sound of it settled into the room the same way the pine scent had settled into the morning air. Present, and not entirely unwelcome. She had made her choice. Now she would see what it meant. The first week at the Iron Crest passed the way first weeks in unfamiliar places always do, in the accumulation of small details that slowly build into something like understanding. Lucy learned the keep's rhythms the way she had learned everything else in her life, by paying attention. The morning bell rang at the same time, regardless of season, and by the second toll the kitchens were already producing bread and broth for the household. The guard changed at the 4th bell and the 8th. The great hall filled for the evening meal at sunset, when the pack gathered with the particular combination of noise and structured hierarchy that Lucy was beginning to read like a language. She learned that Kale was the beta of the Iron Crest pack, Aiden's second, his childhood companion, and the person most responsible for keeping the Alpha King's more intimidating tendencies from turning routine administrative meetings into experiences that left visiting nobles requiring a period of quiet recovery. She learned that Dorian was the pack's Gamma, its strategist, a man whose mild expression concealed a mind that moved several steps ahead of any conversation he appeared to be merely observing. She learned that Wren, who managed the household linens and spoke at the speed of a mill stream in spring, had grown up in the keep as the daughter of a former packmate, and knew every corridor, every hidden staircase, and every person within the walls with the comprehensive intimacy of someone who had never lived anywhere else. Wren was 25, unmarried by choice, and possessed of opinions about everything that she delivered with cheerful certainty, whether or not anyone had asked. She was also, Lucy discovered within 3 days, the most genuinely kind person she had encountered in years, and that was not a small thing. The herb garden was worse than Aidan had described, which was saying something. The rosemary had not merely gone to wood. It had colonized 2 adjoining beds and was making territorial advances on a 3rd. The mint situation that Wren had mentioned was, if anything, understated. The drainage in the north bed was exactly as problematic as he had said, and the previous keeper had apparently addressed this by simply avoiding planting anything there, which solved nothing and created a breeding ground for the kind of damp rot that spread quietly into neighboring roots before anyone noticed. Lucy spent her first 3 days doing nothing but assessment. She walked every bed, tested the soil with her fingers, traced the water lines, and filled a full parchment with notes in her small, precise handwriting. On the 4th day, she began the actual work. It was hard, and it was good. The kind of hard that uses the body completely and quiets everything else. She was on her knees in the north bed on the 5th morning, clearing compacted soil to lay the crushed stone drainage base she had requested from the keep's stores, when she became aware of someone standing at the garden gate. She did not look up immediately. She had learned at the market that looking up every time someone appeared made you seem like you were waiting for permission, and she had never been very good at waiting for permission. "The crushed stone should go 8 inches deep," said Aidan's voice. "The ground under that bed sits on clay. Anything less, and the water will still pool in hard rain." Lucy sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was standing at the gate in a plain dark tunic, no armor, no fur mantle, with his braided hair pushed back, and his arms crossed over his chest in the posture of someone who was trying to look as though they had simply been passing by, which was not entirely convincing. "I was planning for 10, she said. A pause. "That will work," he said. He did not leave. Lucy returned to her digging. After a moment, she heard the gate open, and then he was crouching beside the bed, picking up a handful of the soil she had cleared and pressing it between his fingers with the focused attention of someone who actually knew what they were looking at. "You've grown things before," she said. It was not a question. "My mother kept a garden when I was young," he said, "before we came to the keep. She grew everything herself. She said the work kept her honest." Lucy glanced at him sideways. He was still looking at the soil in his hand. "She seems like someone who would say that," Lucy said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, like something that existed in that direction. "She says many things," he replied, most of them accurate. They worked in silence for a while. Or rather, Lucy worked, and Aidan remained in the garden in the way that large, quiet things remain in spaces, present without demanding acknowledgement. He did not offer unsolicited advice again, which she appreciated. He did not fill the silence with conversation for its own sake, which she appreciated more. What she did not appreciate, or rather, what she appreciated in the inconvenient way one appreciates things that complicate simple situations, was how natural the silence felt. She had spent 3 years alone, and had built a reasonable peace with silence. This was different. This silence had another person in it, and was somehow still restful. She did not know what to do with that. After perhaps an hour, a guard appeared at the gate with a sealed parchment, and Aidan rose, brushed the soil from his hands with the efficiency of someone returning to the version of himself that ran a kingdom, and walked back through the gate without ceremony. He paused at the threshold. "The calendula in the second bed is salvageable," he said, without turning around. The roots are still good." He left. Lucy looked at the second bed. He was right. The trouble began in the second week. It arrived in the form of Lady Seraphine of the Dawnridge pack, a visiting noble whose arrival had apparently been anticipated by everyone in the keep except Lucy, and whose presence immediately altered the atmosphere of the great hall in the specific way that certain personalities alter atmospheres simply by entering them. Seraphine was tall, dark-haired, and possessed of the particular confidence that came from never having been told at any point in her life that she was anything less than the most important person in any given room. She was the daughter of the Dawnridge Alpha, and she had been brought to the Iron Crest, Wren explained in a rapid undertone while they passed in the corridor, because there had been discussions. Wren's word was discussions, delivered with careful neutrality, between the two packs regarding a formal alliance. An alliance of the kind that was sealed not with signatures on parchment, but with something considerably more permanent. "She intends to be chosen as his mate," Wren said, with the bluntness of someone who considered it more useful to say things plainly. "Her father intends it. Half the court expects it. She has been angling toward it for 2 seasons." Lucy absorbed this information and decided it was entirely irrelevant to her. She returned to her garden. The difficulty was that Seraphine, for reasons that became clear within 2 days, had developed a specific and pointed awareness of Lucy's existence. It started small. A comment at the evening meal, delivered loudly enough to Carrie, about the curious practice of seating household servants near the family table. A question directed at Alara, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, about whether it was customary at the Iron Crest to extend such particular accommodations to packless Omegas. A request, passed through one of her attendants, that the herb keeper be reminded to use the servants' entrance to the great hall rather than the main corridor. Lucy used whatever entrance was convenient and said nothing. But the third incident was more deliberate. She was returning from the village below the pass, where she had traded for seed stock that the keep's stores did not carry, when Seraphine appeared on the inner courtyard steps with 2 of her attendants, positioned in the particular way that suggested the encounter was not accidental. "You are the herb keeper," Seraphine said, looking at Lucy the way one looks at something one is deciding whether to step around or simply over. "I am," Lucy said. "I have heard you came from a market stall in Aldenmoor." The smile was practiced and precise. "It is admirable, I suppose, that Alara found a use for you. She always did have a soft feeling for strays." The word landed with the deliberateness it was intended to carry. Lucy looked at Seraphine steadily. She thought about Roderick at the market, the calculation behind his disdain, the assumption that she would absorb the blow and lower her eyes. She thought about 3 winters in a borrowed kitchen, about how much energy she had spent in her life making herself smaller for people who would not have noticed the effort either way. "Lady Seraphine," she said, with a composure that cost her nothing because she had built it over years out of materials that did not break easily. "I was brought here because I am good at my work. I intend to continue being good at my work. If my presence troubles you, I am afraid the garden is still going to need tending regardless." She stepped around Seraphine and continued toward the east wing. Behind her, she heard one of the attendants make a sharp intake of breath. She did not turn around. What she did not see, because her back was turned, was that Aidan had been standing in the shadow of the covered walkway above the courtyard, since before Seraphine had positioned herself on the steps. He had heard every word. He remained still until Lucy had disappeared through the east wing door, and then he turned to look at Seraphine with the same expression he had turned on Roderick in the square. 3 seconds. Seraphine, who was a great many things, was not unintelligent. She understood what that look meant without needing it explained. She went inside. That evening, Alara came to the garden. Lucy was working by the last of the daylight, tying back the salvaged calendula stems, when she heard the familiar tap of the walking staff on the stone path. She looked up. The old woman settled onto the low stone bench at the garden's edge, the one Lucy had cleared of moss on her second day, on the instinct that someone ought to be able to sit there, and watched her work with the same quality of complete attention she had given her at the market. "Seraphine spoke to you today," Alara said. "She did," Lucy said, "and you answered her well." "I answered her honestly," Lucy said. "I am not sure it was well." "In my experience," Alara said, "those are usually the same thing." She was quiet for a moment, her hands folded over the staff. "I want to tell you something about my son." Lucy kept her hands moving among the calendula stems, but her attention sharpened. "Aiden has ruled this pack since he was 19 years old," Alara said. "His father died in the 3rd year of a border war, and Aiden ended that war in 4 months. He has kept this territory at peace for 11 years through a combination of strength, strategy, and the particular quality of stillness he has. The kind that makes people believe, correctly, that he has already thought further ahead than they have." She paused. "He is not a man who does things without intention." Lucy said nothing. She waited. "He has been to that garden every morning since you arrived," Alara said. "I thought you should know that, not because I am telling you what to think about it, but because you are someone who deserves to have accurate information." Lucy sat back on her heels. The last light was leaving the garden, turning the stone walls the color of old honey, and somewhere above the keep, the first stars were beginning to show through the darkening sky. "Why me?" she asked quietly. It was the question she had been carrying since the market square, and she was tired of carrying it without giving it a voice. "He is the Alpha King. She is a lord's daughter. I am—" "You are someone who stood beside a stranger in a market square, because it was the right thing to do," Alara said, with a simplicity that silenced everything else. "And you did it without knowing who the stranger was, which means you did it for the reason itself." She rose from the bench, leaning on her staff. "Aiden has been surrounded his entire life by people who act well when they know they are being watched. He has never been very good at trusting that." She looked at Lucy with those gray eyes that held everything steady. "Until recently." She walked back toward the keep. Lucy remained in the garden for a long time after the light had fully gone, her hands still among the calendula roots, thinking about what it meant to do the right thing when no one important was watching, and thinking about a man who had noticed. The frost came early that year. Lucy noticed it first in the garden, the way the soil hardened overnight between the 3rd and 4th week of her arrival, the way the morning air carried a bite that went deeper than autumn cold and settled into the bones like a warning. She covered the more delicate beds with straw and burlap before dawn, working by torchlight, and had the new drainage channels fully packed with crushed stone before the first hard freeze arrived. The Iron Crest pack noticed her the way packs notice things that become part of their daily rhythm, gradually and then completely. The kitchen servants learned that she traded dried herbs for bread without needing to be asked. The guards at the east gate learned that she was out before the first bell most mornings and began leaving the smaller door unlatched for her. The pack healer, an older wolf named Edmund with gray at his temples and a precise, careful manner, came to the garden on the 8th day to inspect her work and left 2 hours later having shared 3 remedies she had not known and received 4 she had not expected to give. "You learned from a good teacher," Edmund said before he left. "The best I ever knew," Lucy said. He nodded, and that was enough. Even the pack members who had watched her arrival with the wariness reserved for unknown quantities began to soften, not through any effort Lucy made to win them, but through the simple accumulation of days in which she was consistently, quietly herself. She did not attempt to claim space she had not earned. She did not pretend to be other than what she was. She worked, she learned, she contributed, and she asked for nothing beyond what had been agreed. Wren told her, at the end of the 2nd week, that 3 separate pack members had gone to Alara independently to say the herb keeper was a good fit for the keep. Lucy received this information with a warmth she did not entirely know how to hold. The formal pack assembly was called on the 15th day. Lucy learned about it from Wren, who appeared in the garden that morning with bright eyes and the particular energy of someone carrying significant news. "Seraphine's father has sent a formal petition," Wren said, lowering her voice to a rapid undertone, despite the fact that they were alone among the herb beds. "A written proposal for the alliance. He is requesting that Aiden name Seraphine as his chosen mate before the first snow, to be announced at a gathering of all allied packs." She paused. "He has framed it as a political necessity, border security, unified territories, the usual arguments." Lucy kept her hands in the soil. "That is his right," she said carefully. "It is a reasonable alliance by any political measure." "It is," Wren agreed. Then, with the bluntness Lucy had come to trust, "Aiden has not responded to the petition. He has had it for 4 days and has said nothing." Lucy said nothing either. "He was in the garden again this morning," Wren added, "before you came down. He was just standing there, looking at what you'd done with the north bed." Lucy sat back on her heels and looked at the north bed. The drainage was clean, the raised edges held firm, and she had planted winter savory along the border, which would establish its roots before the ground froze completely and come back stronger in the spring. She thought about what Alara had said, about a man surrounded by people who acted well when they knew they were being watched. She thought about a choice she had made in a market square, without knowing it would lead her here. The assembly was held in the great hall at the evening bell. Lucy did not attend. It was not her place to attend a pack assembly, and she had not been invited, and she was comfortable with both of those facts. She remained in the east wing, working by candlelight on a catalog of the garden's current inventory. What had been salvaged, what had been replanted, what would need to wait for spring. She was halfway through the list when the door opened. She looked up. Aiden stood in the doorway. He was in full formal dress. The black leather armor, the cross straps, the dark fur mantle across his shoulders, the marks of his rank at his collar. He looked as though he had come directly from the assembly, which, she would learn later, he had. He looked at her across the small room with the particular quality of attention she had learned to recognize over 15 days. Complete, unhurried, and somehow both more and less readable than it appeared. "The assembly is finished?" she asked. "It is," he said. "And the petition?" He was quiet for a moment. "I declined it," he said. Lucy set down her quill. "That will have consequences," she said carefully. "The Dawn Ridge Pack will not receive that well." "No," he agreed. "It will require managing." He said this with the tone of someone for whom requiring managing was simply another item among many, not a source of particular concern. He stepped into the room, and the candlelight shifted around him. "I want to tell you something." She waited. "I was at the great market of Aldenmoor because my mother had disappeared before dawn, and my entire guard was quietly panicking," he said, with a dryness that suggested this was not the first time Alara had caused a quiet panic. "When we found her, she was standing beside a packless Omega who had just publicly corrected Roderick the hide merchant in front of half the market." He paused. "I have known Roderick for 11 years. No one has ever corrected him in public. Most people with considerably more standing than a market stall do not consider it worth the risk." Lucy said nothing. "I noticed you before my mother introduced you," he continued. "I noticed you the moment I saw where you were standing and understood what you had done." He looked at her steadily. "I have spent 11 years learning to read people quickly, because ruling a pack requires it. I am not always right, but I was not wrong about you." The candle between them moved in a draft from the corridor, sending the light across the planes of his face, catching the blue of his eyes. "I am a packless Omega from a market stall," Lucy said, not with self-pity, with the precision of someone making sure the full picture was visible. I have no lineage, no political value, no alliance to offer. Seraphine would have given you the Dawnridge territory and a unified border. Yes, he said. That is not a small thing. No, he agreed. It is not. He took one step closer, and his voice remained low and even, the way it always was, carrying its weight without needing to raise itself. But I have been making decisions based on political value for 11 years, and I have become very good at it, and it has made me very certain of one thing. He stopped. The one decision I will not make that way is this one. Lucy stood up slowly from her chair. They were close now, close enough that she could see the detail of the worn leather at his collar, close enough that the iron and resin scent that she had stopped pretending she did not notice was simply present in the air between them, settled and real. I am not asking you to decide anything tonight, he said. I am not asking you to be anything other than what you are. But I want you to know that what you are is... He stopped again, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw him search briefly for the right word, which somehow made him more real than anything else had. What I have been looking for without knowing I was looking. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind that held things carefully. Lucy looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the market square, and the coins in her hand, and the road north through the pine forest, and the garden that was already beginning to recover under her care. She thought about what it meant to be seen, not assessed, not tolerated, not accommodated, but genuinely seen, by someone who had no reason to pretend. I am not going anywhere, she said quietly. I told your mother 3 months. The corner of his mouth moved, that suggestion of a smile that existed just past the edge of his usual expression. 3 months, he repeated. At minimum, she said. He reached out and took her hand, carefully, without pressure, the way he had placed his hand at Alara's elbow on the uneven stone, with a practice that looked like ease. His thumb crossed her knuckles once. Then I have 3 months to be worth staying for, he said. The first snow came 12 days later. Lucy stood at the East Garden gate in the early morning and watched it fall, soft and deliberate, covering the straw-protected beds, settling on the stone walls, turning the iron crest into something from the kind of story her mother used to tell on winter evenings by a small fire. Wren appeared beside her with 2 cups of something warm. Seraphine left yesterday, Wren said, handing her a cup. She was not gracious about it, but she left. Her father sent a strongly worded message, and Aidan sent back a trade agreement that was generous enough to make refusing it politically difficult. She sipped from her own cup. Dorian drafted it. He is very good at making compromises look like victories. And the Dawnridge border? Lucy asked. Secured through the agreement, Wren said. No alliance mate required. She smiled sideways. Turns out there were other ways to solve the problem. They just required more creativity. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the snow fall on the recovering garden. Wren, Lucy said after a while. Did you know? When you came to meet me in the courtyard that first day, did you already know what Alara intended? Wren was quiet for just long enough to be telling. Alara does not explain her intentions in advance, she said carefully. She simply acts, and then things happen in a direction she apparently already knew they would. She paused. But I think she knew from the moment you stood beside her in that square. I think she understood something then that most people would have needed considerably longer to see. Lucy thought about gray eyes that held still water over ancient stone. She saw that you were good, Wren said simply. Not good at performing goodness for people who mattered. Just good, the way that runs all the way down. 3 months passed, and then another month, and another. The winter garden gave way to a spring garden that was better than anything the Iron Crest had seen in years. according to Edmund, who said it with the careful understatement of a man not given to excessive praise, which meant it was a genuine compliment. The calendula came back strong. The rosemary was cut back to healthy wood and began new growth from the base. The north bed drained perfectly through every rain. On a morning in early spring, when the light was returning to the hills and the first green was showing at the edges of the forest, Aidan came to the garden as he had come every morning since the beginning, and this time he brought something in his hand. It was small, a sprig of new lavender from the second bed, the first growth of the season, barely more than a suggestion of purple against gray-green leaves. He held it out to her without a word. She took it, looked at him. "Stay," he said. One word, carrying everything. She had been staying. She had known for some time that she had been staying. But there is a difference between remaining somewhere and choosing it, and this was the moment of choosing. And she understood that he was not asking her to choose him over something better. He was asking her to choose something real over the habit of expecting less. "Yes," she said. The formal bond was made at midsummer, before the assembled pack, in the great hall, hung with summer banners. Elara stood at the front, her walking staff in hand, and her gray eyes bright with the particular satisfaction of someone who has watched a thing unfold exactly as she understood it would. Cale wept, which he denied afterward with considerable energy. Dorian did not weep, but stood very still in the way he did when something mattered more than he intended to show. Wren wept openly and without apology, and then laughed at herself, and then wept again. Lucy stood in the great hall in a gown the color of winter sky. Deep gray blue, simple in cut but good in cloth, made by Marta the weaver, who had traveled 3 hours from Aldenmore when the invitation arrived because she said she would not miss it for any sum, with her pale hair braided and her mother's cloak folded carefully in the chest upstairs, because she did not need it anymore. She had something better now. She had a place that was hers, not borrowed. A garden that was growing. A pack that had learned her name and meant it when they used it. And she had Aidan, who stood beside her with his hand in hers, and said his words to her in the same low, even voice he used for everything, except that today there was nothing controlled about it. It was simply true. The way things are true when they have been stripped of everything that is not essential. Roderick the hide merchant heard about the bonding 3 days later, through the usual channels of market gossip, and sat very quietly in his stall for the remainder of the afternoon. Elara, when told about his reaction, said only, "Good," and returned to her book. Lucy never forgot the market square. She never forgot the weight of the coins in her hand, or the road north through the pine forest, or what it had felt like to stand beside a stranger simply because it was right. She had not known in that moment what she was standing beside. But Elara had looked at her with gray eyes that held ancient water, and had understood something true about her, before Lucy had understood it herself. That goodness, when it is real, does not go unrecognized forever. It only needs the right eyes to find it. And it had.